My name is Thomas Gallagher. I'm 53 years old, and for almost 30 of them, I worked as a gravedigger in a small cemetery in northern Michigan, an isolated place, surrounded by tall pine trees and a lake so still that, on foggy mornings, it looked like a piece of glass forgotten in the middle of the forest. And when I say isolated, I'm not exaggerating. The nearest town was a 20-minute drive away, and in winter, when the snow piled up and the roads froze, that trip could easily turn into an hour of pure tension. I've always been a simple man. I was born in Georgia, grew up in a house with more siblings than space, and started working early because my father needed help. At 19, I moved to Michigan looking for a steady job, preferably far from the mess of the big city. I never liked noise, crowds, traffic, those places where everything feels urgent all the time. I wanted silence, peace, and ironically, that's exactly what led me to spend almost 3 decades surrounded by people who never complained, because they were dead. It may sound strange, but working with death never scared me. On the contrary, it was honest, predictable, routine work. There was respect in it. There was room for reflection. And the cemetery where I worked, Lakeside Memorial Grounds, was practically a painting in how calm it was. Big, green, well-kept. It had gravel trails cutting across the property, a small tool shed, an old wooden chapel, and a fence separating the back area from the forest around the lake. For many years, that place was my world. I tended the graves, cut the grass, trimmed the trees, supervised burials, cleaned the shed, and handled small repairs. And to be honest, I was happy doing that. It was lonely, but I was never afraid of loneliness. Real fear, the kind that squeezes your chest and doesn't let go, I would only know much later, and it wasn't because of any dead person. It all started in the winter of 2019, a particularly cold winter, the kind that makes you feel pain in bones you've forgotten you had. I remember because at that time I was working alone, after the older groundskeeper retired. The cemetery didn't have a budget to hire someone else right away, so I had to handle everything: maintenance, funerals, grave digging, paperwork, everything. It wasn't easy, but I managed. That month, we had 3 funerals in a row, all in the same area, near the lake's edge. I always hated digging near the lake when the ground froze. The soil turns hard as concrete. Tools break. Your hands freeze, even with thick gloves. And on top of that, it was the most isolated part of the cemetery, so far out that the lights barely reached it. Beautiful during the day, but at night, at night it felt like another world. But I was never afraid to work there. Never. Until the day I noticed something that has haunted my mind ever since. Tuesday, January 14th. I arrived at work at 6:30 in the morning. Snow from the night before had covered everything, leaving the cemetery white and silent. Beautiful, but hard to work in. The funeral was at 11, so I needed to check the grave I had prepared the day before, make sure nothing had frozen too much. I took the truck, turned the heater to full blast, and drove to the back area, where the narrow trail led to the new section by the lake. When I parked, I noticed something strange. Footprints in the snow. They weren't mine or the funeral director's. No one had been there since late the previous afternoon, when I finished the job. And those footprints, they were fresh, boot prints, large, deep, coming from the trail that led to the road, going straight to the grave, and then disappearing, simply vanishing, as if the person had evaporated. I looked around, trying to understand. The snow was untouched. No track leading away. Maybe the snow fell over the return path, I thought, but that made no sense. Only light, thin snow had fallen, not enough to cover fresh prints. I knelt near the grave to inspect. The track stopped exactly at the edge, as if someone had stood there, looking in. Then nothing. No return. No detour. Nothing. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the cold. In almost 30 years at that cemetery, I had learned the difference between something normal and something that didn't fit. This didn't fit. But I tried not to overthink it. Maybe just some curious person. Teenagers sometimes sneak in at night. Possible. Not convincing, but possible. During the funeral, I couldn't stop looking toward that area. It was irrational, but I felt as if someone was out there, watching. Not in the chapel, not among the people, but outside in the open field. That night, I decided to return to that part of the cemetery. I never make 2 rounds in the same day, but those footprints wouldn't leave my mind. I brought my big lantern, the kind that lights up like a car headlight, and walked down the trail. The snow had nearly stopped, and the silence was so heavy that each step echoed. When I arrived, I nearly dropped the flashlight. The footprints were there again, fresh, as if someone had just passed through. But this time, there wasn't just an inbound path. Now, there was a full trail. Someone had gone to the edge of the grave and then walked back on the same path. Except something was wrong. Very wrong. I approached slowly. The snow reflected the lantern's beam, making the trail look bluish. When I crouched to look closer, I noticed that the outbound and return prints were different. The ones going to the grave were deep, but the ones returning, they were shallow, uneven, as if the person had been dragging their feet, or tired, or hurt, or I don't even know. But that wasn't the worst part. The returning prints were angled strangely. The feet weren't pointing forward. They were slightly twisted, as if the person had turned without turning their body, as if they had walked back, facing the grave. My stomach dropped. I can't explain why, but that detail hit me like a punch. It felt too wrong to be coincidence. And deep down, I knew it wasn't teenagers. Teenagers make noise. They leave trash. They break things. This wasn't a prank. I was uneasy, sure, but still functional, still able to work, still able to pretend nothing was wrong. Fear has no place in that job. But the next morning, everything changed. The wind had blown the thin snow aside, and the tracks were clear as if freshly made. I followed them to the grave I had filled after the funeral. The soil was smooth, even except for one detail. On the left corner, someone had placed a hand, a perfect imprint, as if someone had pressed their fingers there during the night. A large hand, very large. And what froze my veins wasn't the size. It was the fact that the handprint was clean. No snow, no ice, no dirt, as if it had been left when the soil was still damp hours earlier. I looked again. There were 3 identical prints, each one pointing in a different direction, as if someone had used them to push themselves up. That was the moment I felt something I had never felt in 30 years in that cemetery. Panic, real panic, the kind that makes your body want to run, even if you won't admit you're afraid. I backed away, breathing hard, trying to convince myself it was a misunderstanding, that someone was messing with me, that it had an explanation. But the truth was that, for the first time, I didn't want to be there. I got back into the truck, shut the door hard, and sat there gripping the steering wheel. The lake was motionless, the forest still, the silence absolute. And then it all made too much sense. The trail, the footprints, the hand. This wasn't teenagers. This wasn't a trespasser. This wasn't normal. Someone was coming into the cemetery. Someone strong. Someone who walked in the snow without difficulty. Someone who approached graves. Always at night. Always alone. Always leaving only the bare minimum of evidence. And suddenly it hit me. This person wasn't just passing through. They were watching. And I was the only one who knew. I should have called the police that day. I know that now. But at the time, with nearly 3 decades of experience and 0 incidents, I did what stubborn men do. Ignored my instincts and tried to rationalize. Told myself it was coincidence. That I was tired, overworked, alone too much. And maybe it was all nothing. At least, that's what I repeated to myself as I walked through the administration hallway, trying to pretend nothing had happened. But at night, like always, the mind doesn't care about logic. I remember the feeling when I got home, took off my boots, hung up my coat, and sat in the armchair without turning the lights on. I stared at my own hands, imagining the large handprint on the frozen soil. Impossible to forget. I tried watching TV. Didn't work. Tried reading. Didn't work. I fell asleep out of exhaustion. The next morning, I went to work with the same weight in my chest. I still didn't want to go near the lake area. So I started on the eastern side, where the oldest graves were. The sun was weak, the wind blowing from the lake, carrying that damp smell of melting ice. I was trimming branches when I heard the first sound, a crack, light, like a twig snapping. Not unusual, lots of trees around. But the second crack came less than a minute later. Then the third, then silence. I froze listening. Not close, not far. It was like it was following me. Every time I moved along the trail, another sharp, spaced-out noise came from behind the trees. I forced myself to keep working. I had no proof it wasn't just wind or animals. But the sensation of being watched, was so strong it felt physical, like static on the back of my neck. Then came the sound that made me stop. Footsteps. Slow, dragging footsteps. Behind me, not in the trees, not in the brush, but on the gravel trail. A few meters away. I spun around so fast the tool almost slipped from my hand. The trail was empty, completely empty, but something was there. I felt it. Don't ask me how. I just did. The sound had been real. 2 dragging steps, like someone testing their weight. I walked to the spot. Looked down. My pulse jumped. The gravel was disturbed. Not much. Not obvious. But enough for someone who walks that path every day to notice. Someone had stepped there, but without leaving a print, because snow doesn't settle on that trail. And then a new thought came. What if the person is coming into the forest side? I had never considered it because theoretically, it was impossible. The metal fence was intact, and behind it was a dense patch of pine trees that no one could cross without leaving broken branches and signs. But the truth was, I hadn't checked the fence in months. I went to the back area, the part where the cemetery touched the forest. Almost no reason to go there. Lantern in hand, even in daylight, I walked slowly. With each step, the silence fell heavier. When I reached the fence, I saw exactly what I feared. A hole, small, but large enough for a thin person. The fence wires were bent inward, as if someone had pulled them from the outside. Twisted metal. Disturbed ground. Not much, but enough for someone paying attention. I touched the wire. Cold, but not frozen solid. It felt recently handled. No footprints, just leaves and uneven snow. But the sensation that someone had been there tightened every muscle in my body. I stood, looking into the forest. The wind swayed the tall pines, creating a soft musical sound. But underneath, something else. A thick, active silence, like eyes watching. Instinct made me step back. And then I heard it. A whisper, not a word. Not human. A low, deep sound, like a long, controlled exhale, coming from the forest. I didn't stay to find out. I left that area faster than a man my age should. Not running, but close. That night, I did something I'd never done. Closed the cemetery early. Locked everything. Left with the feeling I was leaving something behind that shouldn't be there. But the worst was still coming. 2 days later, admin called. A visitor complained that objects left on graves had been moved or removed. Teenagers. The receptionist sighed. But I no longer believed that. When I reached the area, something felt wrong. Old section, spaced out tombstones, gray stone, moss on the edges. In winter, even lonelier. The visitor was right. Objects had been moved. Flowers from the right, placed on the left. Candles closer to the headstone. A small angel figurine turned to face the opposite side. But what froze me was a pattern. Everything was aligned. Obsessively aligned. Perfectly parallel. Too precise for vandalism. I walked slowly between the graves. The more I looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't random. Someone had been there. Someone who knew the cemetery. Someone comfortable enough to touch items left by grieving families, and comfortable enough to stay long enough to arrange them with almost mathematical precision. At the 5th grave, my stomach dropped. Later that afternoon, I searched the entire cemetery for signs. Hours walking, watching the lake, the fence, the trees. Nothing unusual. Until the sun began to set, turning the ice red and gold. Near the lake, something was wrong. The snow along the shore was disturbed. Recently, I got closer. A bad taste filled my mouth. The kind that comes before seeing something you don't want to see. Footprints, but not normal footprints. Bare footprints. In the snow. Someone had been walking barefoot in below-zero weather. The tracks went from the lake to a large tree where we used to leave old tools before tossing them. And near the tree, something even worse, a pair of jeans, folded neatly, as if someone had calmly undressed before entering the cemetery. I didn't touch them. My breath grew heavy. For a second, I wondered if it was all stress, but it was too real, far too real. I reached for the radio, thought about calling the police, but something else caught my attention. To my left, in the trees, something moved, fast, low, silent. I swung the lantern, but nothing, just shapes, bark, darkness pooling between trunks. I stood there for seconds that felt like minutes, and for the first time since everything started, I was absolutely certain I was not alone in that cemetery, and whoever was there wasn't there to visit a grave. A flower vase had been placed dead center, but not as decoration. It sat inside a perfectly round, precise indentation, as if someone measured it. Not vandalism, not a prank, preparation. For what? I didn't know.